All right, first I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Hart, for agreeing to do this and taking the time to meet me. I grow increasingly intrigued with not just your position, but also just learning from people like you, because you are of such importance within the athletic community, especially as it pertains to the COVID-19 pandemic and how you've seen collegiate athletics progress. So thank you.
Dr. Natali, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to a conversation about life as a commissioner during COVID.
You're right. It's very, very challenging, I would imagine, and we'll get into that. I just first want to introduce and give you some background to our viewers. And Dr. Hart has earned his doctorate in management from Webster University, where his dissertation focused mainly on factors of persistence for NCAA Division III student athletes. His time as are in the Division III also continued in athletic directing capacity for around 25 years. These experiences obviously primed Dr. Hart for the USA South Commissioner, Conference Commissioner position, where he has spent the last 5 years. None certainly more challenging than 2020, 2021, right?
That would be an accurate statement.
All right, so let's just get right into it with question one. How did the conference, as we went into quarantine last year, as we know, how did the conference and its members respond to being quarantined in the spring, and how did that impact the summer?
So there's been a transition of reactions, I would say, for small college athletics. The positions that folks took last spring were much more decisive and in a quick fashion. I think if everyone can remember that Friday the 13th, when the NCAA pulled the plug on a number of their championships, our leadership also began to immediately convene and figure out what that meant for us in our conference. So our conference has 19 or 18 members,
18, yeah.
and we're spread out from Virginia to Alabama. And so a variety of decisions that have to be made even on a state-by-state basis.
Right.
But back last spring, it was much more of nobody knew what was going on with the disease, with the virus, how it impacted. And so very quickly, I think we were less than 10 days from that. By the end of March, we had shut down everything, as had pretty much every Division II, Division III conference in the country, realizing that there was much uncertainty, and given the consequences if you didn't act properly, I don't think anybody was willing to take the chances. So last spring, it was just basically shut her down, and then we'll begin to think about what the fall and then the winter would look like as we move forward. And in those two places, I think there was a much more measured response.
Okay.
For example, the NCAA didn't come out and say that they wouldn't have fall sports for Division III until August 5th, right? Only 6 weeks before the start of the season. And as we've seen in the winter championship model, they were only 6 weeks away from the culmination of the season. So in each section, we found ourselves having a further and further decision point. Some conferences would immediately say, well, we can't do the fall. But that timetable, there was I would say another 7 to 8 weeks before other conferences got to the same place. Many looking to do some sort of competition on their own campuses or even in their own conference, and not really just looking at it on the local level as opposed to the national level.
Sure. Certainly challenging, especially with the large geographical area that you have, that your conference, has.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a great point, because not only are there 6 states that we're in, but even within the states themselves, the local community, in many cases, it's the county, have taken stances on quarantining, on how, who do we follow, how do we do it.
Right.
The NCAA, and then you've got the NCAA that's also weighed in on a number of occasions with recommendations, right? But when the NCAA recommends something, you better have a great reason not to follow those reasons. And in some cases, I think institutions have done that, where they've said, that makes sense at the Division I level, doesn't really translate to the Division III level as much.
Mm.
And then, so if you think about the local, so we've found, when we did a survey and found that we were at, some schools were at 7 days, some were at 10 days, some
Yeah.
were at 14 days, just a variety of things that have been said, and standards that had to be met. So yeah, definitely a challenge, no doubt about it.
Pretty wild. So walk me through some of the decision-making processes that you had to go through, or maybe even some of the presidents at the membered institutes, to move fall sports to spring, and then preview what that spring sports has looked like or will look like continued forward.
Sure. So the decision-making process, one of the hallmarks has been continued communication.
Okay.
If I had to characterize it, and as an example, our President's Council, who ultimately is our decision makers, they used to meet, well, in a typical year, would meet
Sure.
twice a year, December and then in May, and we would
Okay.
just bring all actions to them at that place. Since May of last year, we have been meeting monthly with that group, and every month in fact, we just met this morning. Every month we probably have 5 or 6 items that have to be considered with action, with actual action items on a number of those, just to be able to keep things moving. So the monthly meetings combined with the weekly meetings of athletic directors has really amped up the meeting, the Zoom piece for us.
Sure.
But in some ways, it's almost an investment. It's an investment of that hour.
Yeah.
Really helps everybody to understand, where we are and what we need to do, especially as it relates to decisions. So for athletic directors, what we'll do is often ask for straw polls. How do people feel about a particular issue, such as in the fall, should we have a conference season at all? And then should we move the fall sports to the spring? We would do a straw poll just to see where athletic directors fell on that, and then bring that information to presidents for them to be able to weigh in on and consider, because they are our final, they're the ratifying body of anything that we do.
Understand.
And then in addition to that, we about 4 months ago invoked a working group to look at some of these decisions that were going to have to be made, especially when we knew we wanted to play all sports in the spring, related to testing. So we've had one president from each state, as well as a athletic direct report, and then the chair of our President's Council. So 7 out of our 18 presidents have been meeting even more frequently to help come up with recommendations for the presidents. That so testing, as an example, is something that we needed to talk about. How should it be done, and what are some of the cadences we need to consider?
Sounds like the communication piece has been ramped up between all parties for the success of, hey, let's get sports back on the docket here.
Right, and not only ramped up on our end, but also ramped up from the NCAA end. Division III's done a great job of acting quickly. They've got a committee called AdCom, which has been allowed to take some actions, recommendations, whether it be from championships or whether it be from SSI and the Sports Science Institute, and just try to balance those pieces. Because, as an example, one of the biggest challenges has been eligibility. How do we deal with student athletes that aren't playing, and how should we treat them? So the NCAA being nimble and finding ways as an organization to be able to pivot has been critical. And Division III has done a really good job of not only pivoting, but then communicating that pivot through weekly emails and updates.
Sure. That's challenging. And maybe perhaps even another challenge where pivoting is also constantly happening is, and I know some of this information might be confidential, but could you share the impact that the conference members have had financially?
Remains to be seen.
Okay.
Out of our 18 institutions, only one did not return to on-campus, in-person educational model. And some of it may have been a hybrid, but
Understood.
only one institution stayed completely online, did not invite students back to campus.
Okay.
That institution is not obviously participating in intercollegiate athletics this semester.
Oh, that's tough, man.
But the other 17 have fully committed. We had one other institution that opted out of football just because of the cumbersome nature of testing 150 student athletes weekly.
Yeah.
But the financial impact it's hard. I know that there's been a little bit of melt in enrollment, but I don't think it was as catastrophic as perhaps people thought back in the
Mm.
summer.
Hmm.
And in large part not a large part, but in part due to the fact that schools are trying to help student athletes maintain. And I think it's important to know that we're an enrollment driven conference.
Yeah.
And as such, we have many institutions with over 50% of their student population are student athletes.
Student athletes. Yeah.
And so that's why I think there was that concern and the need to balance safety and health with helping students be able to pursue their passions.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You mentioned testing so many on a weekly basis. Could you just give our viewers a little peek on what the cost of that maybe a single test over a week?
Yep. So real briefly, there are two main types of tests. You have PCR tests, which are apparently a lot more accurate, and then you have your rapid antigen tests.
Okay.
PCR tests, depending on the ability of an institution to actually do it, it fluctuates in range from anywhere from $50 to maybe $120 for our type of institutions. Now, obviously, other institutions that are much larger have an easier chance of getting those tests. But so I'd say 50 to 120 has been the range, and depending on state and availability.
Okay. Gotcha.
The rapid antigen tests, which aren't quite so accurate, but are much more, we use those for officials, and a lot of institutions will use those initially.
Okay.
Abbott has a test that was given to all states, and some states have then the trickle down has come to some of the college campuses. Those Abbott tests are like $5 a pop, but even a typical rapid antigen you're going to be able to get for about anywhere from $20 to $25.
Like that adds up after you're doing so many in a week basis,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where an NCAA policy that wants you to test 3 times a week for antigen testing, as they do in football, that can, at the end of the day, if you're taking 1 PCR or 3 antigens, add it together, you're basically still coming out at about $100 of testing cost a week. Right. Per student.
Right.
Which makes things a little bit challenging.
Sure. But, and then going back to the makeup of the institutes within the conference being 50% student athletes, you're testing half of the population on your campus.
And that depends on one of the other things that's a clarification that might be helpful is that the NCAA has different risk categories. So if you're a high risk sport like football or basketball, you test at a much greater frequency and cadence
I see.
than you do an intermediate sport. So as we're heading into the spring with baseball, softball, we're going to do men's and women's soccer, volleyball, lacrosse, tennis. A lot of those sports are intermediate, and you only have to test anywhere from 25 to 50% every 1 or 2 weeks. So instead of testing everybody weekly, there's the cadence calms down quite a bit for intermediate risk sports. So and with that, the costs are a little bit more manageable.
That's good. That's definitely provides some clarification. This is probably one of the bigger, maybe even the bigger question that's maybe not even being asked. And so I wanted to bring this up to you, and that is, what actions, if any, has the conference taken to address the mental health of student athletes during this pandemic?
That's a fabulous question. In fact, last semester when we met with our student athlete advisory committee, and we talked a lot about NCAA legislation and name, image, likeness, and all that kind of stuff. But then we opened it up, and a couple of students, we asked them what were some of the things they'd like to see us do, and about 3 or 4 students volunteered the information, asking that could we do something with mental health,
Mm,
and we've done programs with mental health for our coaches and administrators for the last. We did that 2 years ago, but thought given all the dynamics in the pandemic, that would be a fabulous thing. So
sure,
our
absolutely.
conference, yeah. So for our conference, we've established a 4-part series that's being introduced and provided to our conference student athlete advisory council or committee first, and it's optimizing student athlete mental health. And the program is 4 parts. We're going to
Okay,
do once a month. We
great.
get together on Zoom, and we have got 2 counseling professionals, licensed counseling professionals, that are walking our students through a variety of pieces, everything from self-care to
Mm,
sleep
mm,
to um, nutrition to time management. They're looking at some of the strategies that can be used, but then also looking at how can you identify if one of your teammates is struggling.
yeah, yeah.
In a variety of fashions that could
Mm,
be manifest itself.
hmm.
And so, trying to provide some time for self care habits or strategies, but then also taking time to be able to help these students realize that they may be the first line or the first people that understand how things are going. So we need to keep that in mind as we
Yes,
move through the program. And but for
yeah,
4 months, we're taking, and then the beauty of it is because of the platform, we're able to take that and they can take it back to their campuses. And so
yes.
the PowerPoints, the Zoom, the initial Zoom is recorded, and so then they are able to bring it to their
Fantastic.
campuses, and then hopefully it's a like concentric circles of this topic can be ongoing throughout this semester.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I love the question, but your response was even better. I think that provides some good insight into how your conference is dealing with it. And I certainly hope that other conferences are also successful.
Yeah, and they are. They're in fact a number of our colleagues have similar types of things that they're doing on
I
their
see.
in their conferences.
Fantastic. That's great. All right.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of wraps up our interview. Again, thank you, Dr. Hart, for taking the time. Have a fantastic day.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you down the road.
All right. Bye now.